My grandfather told me that years ago, when he was a young man in the 1920s, that he was approached by a guy that wanted to sell him stock in an up-and-coming new company. And the stock was selling for literally pennies. I don't remember now what the exact cost was, but he told me what it was selling for. It was pennies. And my grandfather decided that he was going to turn it down. He didn't buy the stock. And he decided he wasn't going to buy the stock because he didn't really think the company was going to go anywhere. The guy explained to him what the company was about and what they did. And he goes, I don't think this is going anywhere. And he didn't buy the stock. The name of the company was International Business Machines. You may know it by the initials IBM. I remember saying to my grandfather when he told me that story, wow, what if you had bought that stock? And he said something to me like, I'd be a very rich man. What if? You ever play that game yourself? What if, right? The example I just gave you is an example of playing the what if game in the past tense. We look backwards and say things like, well, what if I would have, right? And that's playing the what if game in the past tense. We can play it in the future tense. I got a hunch that my grandfather probably played the what if game in the future tense when he was approached by this guy to buy the stock. He probably said something like, well, what if this company isn't any good and it goes under, then I'm going to lose my money. That's the what if game in the future sense. A lot of us do that. We go, well, what if I do this, they might say this, and then this might happen. That's the what if game in the future tense. We all play it. We all do it. We play the what if game. We speculate what might have been or what may be. But here's something that's important to remember. For God, there is no what ifs. God never plays the what-if game. And part of the reason that he doesn't play the what-if game, and he doesn't have to play the what-if game, is because he's omniscient. That's a fancy word that means he knows everything. He's all-knowing. Listen to what it says in Psalm 147, 4 through 5. Talking about God, he counts the stars and he calls them all by name. That's just a poetic way of saying, look, do you see all those stars? God knows beyond the stars. How great is our Lord? His power is absolute. His understanding is beyond comprehension. Hebrews 4:13 says this, nothing in all creation is hidden from God. Let me say that again. Let it sink in. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God. That should bring up two feelings in you right now, simultaneously. There should be a feeling of, wow. And there should be a feeling of, whoa. Because that means you can't hide anything from God. I can't hide anything from God. God knows it all. It goes on, it says, everything is naked and exposed before his eyes. You ever wonder why in Genesis, when Adam and Eve fell, the first thing that they realized is they were naked? It was an indication that everything now is exposed. You're exposed. The verse goes on and it says, everything is naked and exposed before his eyes, and he is the one to whom we are accountable. Ouch. You see, here's the deal. What ifs means that there are possibilities. And from our vantage point, there are possibilities. But in God's economies, there are no possible outcomes because he knows it all. There's no detail he doesn't know. Not only is he all-knowing, but get this, and we talk about this all the time, but again, I want it to sink in a little bit. He is sovereign. Sovereign means that he's in control. See, you can know, but not necessarily be in control, perhaps. That's debatable. But just in case we don't realize what it means to know, we have this idea of his sovereignty plugged in as well. He's in control. Listen to Colossians 1:17. He existed before anything else. Listen to this. And he holds all creation together. God holds it all together. Psalm 115:3. Our God is in the heavens and he does as he wishes. Let that sink in. He's all-knowing. He's sovereign. There was an old Southern pastor when I was a kid growing up. And he used to have this saying. He'd say, "Did it ever occur to you that nothing ever occurred to God?" See, to have something occur to you means it just, I never thought about that before. God never comes to a point where he says, wow, I never thought about that before. God never comes to a point where he says, wow, isn't that a surprise? God never comes to a point where he says, really? I never knew that. See, we do that all the time because we're finite creatures. He's infinite. He's all-knowing. He's sovereign. There are no what-ifs with God. And there's a word that we don't hear much anymore. Certainly not in society, but unfortunately in the church. And it's a word that we need to fight for, I believe. It needs to be a word that we're using more often. And the only reason that we don't use it is we don't understand it. And so we're going to talk about it more this morning and try to understand it. And hopefully in that process use it and understand that as we use it, there's rich meaning behind it. This word deals with several qualities of God. That's why so many times if we can find a word that covers a whole array of things, it just makes it easier. And that's this word. It covers a lot of qualities of God. And within that word are the quality of sovereignty and the quality of his omniscience, his all-knowingness. And it's the word providence. Providence. Providence means this, and I don't think this is in your notes, so if you want to jot this down, it's a very simple definition. It's God's guidance and direction over all things. God's guidance and direction over all things. And here's the deal. God can guide and direct because he knows all things and he is sovereign over all things. And also wrapped up in that word providence is care, provision, correction. That's why it's such an amazing, important word. And we can't afford to lose it. It's just so rich. Providence. In fact, it was so important in the early stages of the forming of our country, then many times you would see it in documents, and you can go back and check this out, and it was capitalized because it was used in the place of the word God many times. They would just use the word providence to refer to God because it has all these ideas, his care, his provision, his direction, his guidance, his omniscience, his sovereignty. All wrapped up in this great little word. God knows and he rules and he guides and he directs. His providence is over all. And if it isn't, let me tell you something, all is lost. If providence isn't true and real, we have no hope. And here's why. Because if God is not all-knowing and God is not sovereign, and God is not intricately and intimately involved in the affairs of this world, then you and I cannot know if what he has said will happen, will happen. We have no confidence that anything prophetically still in the future will happen if God is not in control. And if he isn't all-knowing, we have to only wish. See, it's not even a hope, because hope, remember, is a confident expectation of future good. I can't be confident in a God who is not all-knowing and all-powerful and sovereign. Here's where it really gets personal. If providence isn't true, if it's not real, if we don't have a God who knows all, who is sovereign over all, who is intimately and intricately involved in the affairs of this world, you can't even be assured that your future in heaven is secure, because we can't know if he's powerful enough to secure it for us. Do you see how vital this idea of providence is? It not only hits on the things of the world in general, it hits on you and me personally, the providence of God. Providence is this reassuring, mysterious reality that God is fully involved, not just in the big things. For some of us, we look at what's going on in the world and we go, yeah, I can see how God would care about governments and, big ideas. But just the average guy like me, the average woman like me, is God really? Yes. Providence extends beyond just the big things of this world. It goes right into the ordinary. Over the past couple of months, literally the last couple of months, believe it or not, we've been looking at this story of Ruth. It's a story for people that love happy endings. You love happy endings? I do. It's a great story about a happy ending. It's a story for people that love romance. If you're a romantic at heart, Ruth is the book for you. It's a story for people who need to know that God cares about the ordinary. But let me tell you what it's really for. It's for people that need to understand the providence of God. The providence of God is all through this book. The hand of God. And that's what we're going to look at in just a few minutes. But before we do, I want to just review so that we make sure that we know where we're at, because it does no good to talk about the specifics of God's providence in a story that we can't quite remember. So, if you remember back in chapter 1, where everything started, it starts off telling us when this story took place. It took place during the time of the judges. The time of the judges in Israel, remember, was a very chaotic time. It's described in the very last book of the verse of Judges as a time when there was no king, no authority in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It's during this chaotic, turbulent time that the story of Ruth takes place. And the first character we meet is Elimelech. Elimelech is a man. He has a wife named Naomi. They live in Bethlehem. And things seem to be going fairly well. They have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and everything is just kind of going normal. There's nothing dramatic about this family. We're not told that they have a lot of money. They just seem to be an average, normal Israelite family living during the time of the judges, and they find themselves in a severe famine, and Elimelech has a decision to make. What am I going to do? I'm going to have a hard time feeding my family when there's no food, and so he decides, I'm leaving Israel. I'm leaving, remember, from under God's wing, and I'm going to try to figure this thing out for myself. And so he takes his family. They move to Moab. They're there for about 10 years, and during that time, the 2 sons find 2 Moabite women who are not worshipers of God, and they marry these women. Also during that time, and we don't know exactly when, it tells us that Elimelech dies. And Mahlon and Chilion, the 2 sons, they die too. So the very thing that Elimelech's trying to avoid by staying in Israel during a time of famine happens. They die. They leave 3 widows, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. Well, by this time, as we get about the middle of the chapter of chapter 1, Naomi decides it's time to go back to Bethlehem. She hears that there is food again. I have nothing here except my husband's grave. I'm going back there. She starts to make her way back, and she realizes, what am I doing? I can't take these girls with me. This is not a place for them. And she turns and says, go home. You've got a better chance of finding a husband. You've got a better chance of finding rest for your turbulent life back there. Well, Orpah finally decides, you know what? I think you're right, Naomi. I'm going to go back. And so she sorrowfully says goodbye to her mother-in-law, and she goes back. Ruth, on the other hand, the Bible says, clings to Naomi and says, you are stuck with me. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to go where you go. Your people are going to be my people. I'm going to live where you live. Your God is going to be my God. I'm going to die where you die. I'm going to be buried where you're buried. You are stuck with me, Naomi. And Ruth is a committed woman who sticks with her mother-in-law. Naomi realizes can't get rid of her, so I might as well take her with me. And they make their way back to Bethlehem. And as they get to Bethlehem, the people haven't seen Naomi in 10 years. And they begin to go, whoa, isn't that Naomi? No, couldn't be. Where's Elimelech? Wait, man, I think it is. But she looks so different. And as they're talking, Naomi hears them. And she stops them and says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. See, because Naomi means pleasant. Mara means bitter. And if you read chapter 1, you realize that's exactly where Naomi was. She had become a very bitter woman. She believed, and she states this in verse 13 of chapter 1, that the very fist, the very hand of God is against me. Well, things look bleak in chapter 1. The only bright spot is this committed daughter-in-law who stays with her mom, her mother-in-law. When we get into chapter 2, this committed daughter-in-law, Ruth, says, hey, Naomi, I think I should go out and try to find us some food. And Naomi says, yeah, I think you're right. Go ahead and go. She goes, and as she goes, she ends up at a field to glean as a poor person behind the harvesters. And it ends up that she's at the field of a guy named Boaz. Well, Boaz is related to Elimelech. And Boaz is this guy that they call a kinsman redeemer. It's the Hebrew word a goel. It was a very important person in the family. This was the person that was responsible to kind of hold the family honor together. If a family fell into hard times, they could purchase their land for them. If the family fell into hard times and the husband was sold into slavery, he could step in and buy that person back. If that family husband died, he could purchase the land to help the widow, and if he was single or widowed himself, he could marry that person and carry on that family line. Very important person, this kinsman redeemer, this Goel. And Boaz is that guy. Well, Ruth doesn't have any clue. She goes back after a day of gleaning. She's got all this stuff because Boaz has taken a liking to her and told his workers, hey, drop some extra stuff for this girl. And so she goes back and she has 6 days worth of gleaning. And Naomi goes, oh my goodness, where have you been gleaning? This is amazing. And she goes, well, I went to this field of a guy named Boaz. And all of a sudden, ching, 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 Naomi realizes, Boaz? Oh, he's one of our relatives. He's our Goel. You need to make sure that you go back there and you glean every day. Don't go anywhere else, Ruth. And she does. She does through the whole barley season. Boaz says, hey, you stay on through the wheat season. So she's literally there some 3 to 4 months gleaning at Boaz's field, and he's making sure that she's taken care of. Well, we get to chapter 3. Naomi approaches Ruth after all this harvesting and all this time working in Boaz's fields, where Boaz is standing and looking and going, this girl's something special. Ah, she is an amazing woman. And Naomi's hearing the stories that Ruth brings back every day. And in chapter 3, Naomi approaches Ruth and she says, it's time. It's time? What do you mean it's time? It's time for you to take a shower. And for you to put some perfume on. And for you to put some nice clothes on. Boaz is going to be down at the community threshing floor. You're going to go down there tonight. You're going to wait in the shadows until he's laid down to go to sleep. Then you're going to go to the end of his feet and you're going to uncover his feet. And from there, he'll tell you what to do next. Weird stuff as we read it. It was like, what is this? This is just sounding kind of weird. But Ruth says, okay, I'll do it. She does just that. She sneaks down to the threshing floor. She waits until dark. Boaz lays down to sleep. She sneaks in, lays at the end of his feet, uncovers his feet. Somewhere in the night, he feels there's somebody down there. He sits up and he realizes there's a woman. He says, who are you and what's going on? She says, I am your servant, Ruth. Take your covering and put it over me. And we discovered that that word covering literally means wing. She was saying, Boaz, I want you to be God's wing of protection over me. She's proposing to him. It's a beautiful thing. Well, Boaz is all over it. Of course, I want to marry you. But you got to understand something. There's another relative closer than me. And we're going to have to take care of this situation because I can't do this honorably without going to him first. Because, see, Boaz was that kind of a guy. He wasn't about to do something that was dishonorable. So the next day, chapter 4, he goes down to the city gates and he sits there and he waits for the relative to show up. And sure enough, boom, there he is. He shows up and he says, dude, sit right here. I got to get some guys to come and witness our conversation. He gets 10 of the elders of the city. He sits them down. He then says, hey, you know this woman, Naomi. She's Elimelech's wife and she's got this land. And you are the closest relative to purchase the land. You're the closest Goel. And I want to know if you want to buy it, because if you don't want to buy it, I want to buy it. And the guy says, of course I want to buy it. Then Boaz says, but wait. There's this woman named Ruth that is Naomi's daughter-in-law, and if you decide to buy the land, you got to marry her too. Well, I can't do that. And we don't know why he couldn't do it. We don't know if he was already married or if there was something to do with his inheritance to his children. But he said, I can't do it. You do it. You be the Goel. You be the Redeemer. And that's exactly what Boaz does. He purchases the land, and in so doing, he takes Ruth's hand in marriage. And from there, she has a child. And that child is in the line of King David, who's in the line of the Messiah. And it's this amazing story of not just love, but of redemption and of hope. But it's also a story, as I've said, of providence. God's hand is all over this story. And I want to point out to you this morning some lessons that we can learn from the story of Ruth on God's providence. But first, I want to point out some examples, because maybe you're going, yeah, well, where is that providence? I kind of hear what you're saying, but where is it? I'm going to give you one from each chapter, and you're going to be able to find some more on your own, but I just want to give you one from each chapter. Here's the first one. Providence brought Naomi and Ruth to Bethlehem at the right time. So here they are, they're getting ready to go back, right? And here's Orpah, and here's Ruth, and they go, no, we're going to go with you, Naomi. No matter what you say, we're sticking with you. And Naomi says, look, what do you want to stay with me for? You're never going to find a husband back there, and besides that, God's hand is against me. You need to go back. You're better off there. And Orpah says, okay, I'll go. And Ruth clings to her, and they finally make their way back to Bethlehem. And it tells us at the very end of the chapter, in verse 25, they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Big deal. Big deal. Why does that have to be in the story? Why didn't it just say they got back to Bethlehem and then start chapter 2? Why does it tell us that they got there at the beginning of the barley season? Because stop and think about it. They could have ended back there any time. See, here's the thing. If you remember back to when we looked at chapter 2, Israel had this law that if you owned land, that when you harvested that land, you were supposed to not harvest the corners. That produce, that harvest was to be left for the poor and the widowed. They also had a law that said, as you harvest, whatever you drop when you harvest, don't pick it up. leave that as well for the poor and the widowed. It was God's way of making sure that the poor got taken care of. It was God's welfare program for Israel, is really what it was. If Naomi and Ruth get back to Bethlehem in the middle of the harvest, guess what's going to happen? The poor and the widowed have already moved into all the fields available, and they're already gleaning that stuff, and there's no place for Ruth. In fact, if you read some of the tradition and the history of this type of situation, it could get really rough. Do you remember in part of the story that it said that Boaz told his workers not to touch Ruth? You know why it says that? Because it got pretty rough out there. If there were too many poor and widowed to be able to handle this one small field, the workers would literally throw them out. You got to find another field. Get out of here. If Ruth and Naomi don't show up at the right time, Ruth is blocked out of the field. She has no way to glean. If Ruth and Naomi show up at the end of the harvest, she doesn't end up at Boaz's field. They don't meet. There's not this whole romance that goes on and the Redeemer and all of that takes place. Do you see? Even the time that they end up making it to Bethlehem, how does that happen? How do they just happen to get there at just the right time? Providence. God's hand moving. Here's number 2 in chapter 2. Providence brought Ruth to the right field. Remember verse 3 in chapter 2? And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz. I love the way that's worded. It just so happens that as Ruth is out looking for a field to glean, and she ends up at Boaz's field. Just so happens? No, it didn't just so happen. It was God's providence. She could have ended up at anybody's field. She found Boaz's. She was clueless. She didn't know about Boaz. She probably didn't even know about this custom of the Goel, the Redeemer. But she ends up at his field. You go, how did that happen? Providence. God's providence, his invisible hand. Here's number 3, chapter 3. Providence guided Naomi's timing to instruct Ruth on the proposal. Chapter 3 opens with, one day, Naomi said to Ruth, one day? Why that day? Why that particular day? I mean, months have gone by now. The harvest is over. Why didn't Naomi? I mean, she knew way back after the first day that Boaz was the kinsman redeemer. She knew he was the Goel. Why didn't she say after like 2 days? I mean, she had to be anxious. She's a widow. She has nothing. This guy can save us. He can help us. Why doesn't she say, Ruth, look, here's the deal. This is how this works. This is what you need to do. Go right now. Let's get this taken care of. Why does she wait weeks, months, until one day? Why that day? Providence. Providence. God's hand in the activities of just the average, normal stuff of life. And then in chapter 4, number 4, Providence brought the nearest relative to the city gate at the right time. I mean, listen to this. Verse 1. Boaz went to the town gate, took a seat there. Just then, the family redeemer he had mentioned came by. Just then. I mean, can you imagine? Here's Boaz thinking, okay, I got to get down there early. I want to make sure I get a good seat so that I can see and everybody coming in through the city. Because remember, if this were all the business of the city took place. And so he wants to make sure he gets there before it gets filled up. And he'll be able to see everybody coming in. So he'll see when this guy comes in. Wasn't even sure. Maybe he wouldn't come in today, but I'm hoping he comes in today. And so I'm going to get this. This is a great spot right here. And he looks up, boom, and there's a guy right there. How did that happen? Wow. Boaz, you certainly are a lucky guy. Boy, what are the chances? Not a chance. providence. It's God's providence all through this. Like I said, that's one out of each chapter. I hope I'm sparking your interest a little bit to go back and look at the story again and go, ooh, where else do we see God's providence in this story? And I hope I've convinced you at least that providence is all over this story, that we see God's guiding hand all the way through this. And now very quickly, I want to show you some lessons. And again, I think there's more in there, but these are just some that I want to share with you that I've seen as we've gone through this story. Here's number one. The hand of God is always at work, but never seen. You don't see God's hand. It doesn't tell us, and God's hand did this, and God's hand moved it. It's invisible, but you see the results. We talk about Ruth being the main character and Naomi being kind of the secondary main character, but the reality is, folks, in this story, the real main character is God. And the underlying theme is his providence. That's really what's going on in Ruth. So when you walk away from this story today, yes, I want you to remember Ruth, and I want you to remember the Goel, and I want you to remember this beauty of love and redemption and all of that. That's great. But more than that, I want you to remember the main character. It's God, and it's his providence, and it's working in this normal, ordinary story. Wind, right, we know is the movement of air, which is invisible. We can't see wind. Wow, look at that wind. Well, you're not really seeing wind. You're seeing the effects of wind. You're seeing what wind, it blows a tree's leaves, it blows some stuff on the ground. You're seeing the effects of the wind. You're not actually seeing the wind. Now, sometimes you see the effects of the wind in a dramatic way, right? Like in a hurricane. We don't see the wind, but we see the stuff the wind is blowing around. We see the trees bent over, and you can't deny, oh my goodness, there is a lot of wind out here. I can't see it, but I'm seeing the effects. It's major. Most of the time, it's not that big of a deal. Most of the time, the effects of the wind are kind of gentle because it's just maybe a breeze. And most of the time, we don't even pay attention to it. Most of the time, we don't even think about it because it's just kind of happening around us. There's this light breeze. We have to stop and take notice because we can see it moving things a little bit, but not in a major way, and we just kind of live life, and the wind just kind of happens. And like the invisible quality of the wind, God's hand can't be seen, literally, but we see the effects. Sometimes the effects of God's providence of his hand are major. You can't deny it. It's just huge, like a hurricane, right? And other times, most of the time, it's very subtle. It's very quiet. It's like a gentle breeze that we don't even take notice of because we're living life. But it's there. The hand of God is there. Here's number two, second lesson. This is so important. Sometimes the hand of God seems to be against us. That was true of Naomi, wasn't it? She even made the statement right after all this bad goes down. Husband dies, 2 sons die, she's left destitute with these 2 daughter-in-laws, and she says in verse 13 of chapter 1, the Lord himself, listen, has raised his fist against me. His hand, she's saying, is against me. And it looked that way, didn't it? It looked like, oh man, Naomi, this is tough stuff. We believe that God is at work because we can see some of these effects. We can't see his hand, but we know he's at work. But we don't always know what God's plan is. So sometimes we have a tendency, especially when things are bad, to think and at least entertain the thoughts that God is really, he's not for me, he's against me because all this bad has happened. It reminds me of the story of Joseph. You guys are familiar with Joseph. Joseph's brothers sell him. You remember that whole deal? They're jealous of him. They sell him. He ends up in Egypt. He goes from being a prisoner or a slave to being a prisoner in prison. And then he ends up prince. He ends up second in command in Egypt. Well, again, providence of God, a famine hits the land. His brothers, who think he's dead, make their way to Egypt to find food. When they get there, Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him. He asks them, so is this it on your family? Is this all you have? No. We have a brother, a younger brother that's with our father who's still alive back home, and we have another brother who's died. Well, if you remember the story, Joseph accuses them of being spies. You guys are spies. You're here to spy out our wealth. You're from another country and you're here to spy on them. No. We're not spies on us. We're just simple shepherds that have come to help our families. And he goes, well, there's only one way that you can prove it. Go back and bring back that younger brother that you say you have. If you're really not spies, you'll bring that brother back and I'll know you're not spies. And furthermore, to make sure that you make it back, I'm going to take one of you and keep you as prisoner. So I make sure that you come back with that brother. And so he takes Simeon and he puts Simeon under his custody. And the brothers go back and they've got to tell Jacob, their father, look, this is the deal. The guy wants us to bring Benjamin, our youngest, back with us. And he kept Simeon. Listen to how Jacob responds. Genesis 42, Jacob exclaimed, you are robbing me of my children. Joseph is gone. Simeon is gone. And now you want to take Benjamin too? Everything is going against me. Jacob was saying, man, God's hand is against me. It's got to be against me. But if you know the end of the story, you know it wasn't against him. It was actually for him. It appeared like it was against him, but God was doing all this to get the family out of famine and to a place where they would be preserved and cared for. So in Jacob's mind and what he could see, his limited knowledge and vision, he thought God's hand was against him, but it was actually for him. And folks, many times in our lives, it'll seem like God's hand is against us, but it's really for us. Years ago, my younger brother, he had a very serious head injury. And I had forgotten this until I was talking to him the other day, and he was reminding me of the story. But he was unconscious when they got him to the hospital. And so the doctors that were working there said, you know, we don't know what the extent of the injury is. We can't even question him because he's unconscious. We need an MRI. And so they prepped him for this MRI, and they put him in the MRI machine. Now, some of you are familiar with an MRI machine. It's a very tight tube, and it's loud. They usually give you headphones with music or something because those magnets in there are banging around, and it's really loud. But so here's my brother, unconscious. They put him in this tube to get a scan of his head. And, of course, like I said, he was unconscious the whole time. He doesn't know anything of this is going on. He wakes up in the MRI machine. Now, again, if you're not familiar with it, that MRI machine, that tube is like right here. It's just inches from your face. It's white, and it's very bright, and it's loud. The last thing he knew, he was standing up walking somewhere, and somebody had hit him from behind. This is how his injury happened. So, I mean, boom, he wakes up. All he's seeing is white and bright and hearing the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and he freaks. And he's trying to get out of there. He's trying to crawl out of there, and the technicians are there, and they're holding him down, and they're trying to keep him in place, and they're trying to tell him what happened so that he would calm down. It was very frightening and uncomfortable, and he didn't understand why. What is going on? Why am I here? And the very people that were trying to help him, he thought were trying to hurt him. He thought they weren't for him. They were against him. I got to get out of here. I don't know what this is, but this is weird. I got to get out of here. See, folks, sometimes God has to put us through his MRI machine. And in the process of being in there, it's uncomfortable and it's a little scary. But we've got to remember his character. It's not because he's against us. It's because ultimately he's for us. Sometimes it's going to appear as we go through life, man, and I could give you story after story where I was convinced either God had forgotten me or maybe God's really mad with me and against me. But now, looking back at those situations, I realized neither one of those things was true. Not only had he not forgotten me, not only was he involved intimately in my life, he was always for me, even though I thought he was against me. Here's number 3. The hand of God, listen to this, is never frustrated by our poor or bad choices. God's never frustrated by our poor or bad choices. Elimelech made some poor choices. First bad choice, get my family out from underneath God's wing and go to this foreign place of Moab where they worship false gods. First bad choice. No, listen, Elimelech, no matter how bad it looks, under God's wing, it's always better to be there than outside of his wing. But Elimelech made bad choice, moves the whole family over. Second bad choice Elimelech made, or at least from our vantage point, don't let your sons marry these women that worship other gods. That was God's prohibition. It had nothing to do with race. It had everything to do with religion. God did not want the false gods to be mixed in with the people of Israel. He wanted them to be pure in their understanding that there's only one God. Why? Because it dealt with their eternal destiny. That's why. So Elimelech lets this happen, and you go, man, bad choice, bad choice. Is God up there wringing his hands? No. Remember, there's no possibilities with God. There's no situation where God goes, oh, I didn't see that one coming. What are we going to do now? Hey, Gabriel, what do you think? What should we do with this one? There's nothing like that, right? Let me give you an example. Go back to Joseph and his brothers, right? Did Joseph's brothers make a bunch of bad mistakes? Yeah. They sold their brother as a slave. They lied to their dad, taking his coat soaked in goat's blood and said, look, we think he must have been killed by an animal. I mean, these guys were bad choices all over the place. And when they finally meet up with Joseph and Joseph reveals himself, they are scared to death. He's going to get even with us. And in chapter 50 of Genesis, Joseph says, look, you guys, this is taken care of. Verse 20, you intended to harm me. Listen, but God intended all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. Look, you guys were making bad choices all along the way. Joseph never says, hey, don't worry about it. Boys will be boys. No, if you read the story, he makes clear, yeah, you did me wrong. But I am not God to take vengeance on you. In fact, you intended it for evil, but God turned it into good. Our poor choices, our bad choices, never frustrate the almighty hand of God. You go, how does that work? I'm not totally sure. Because God is an amazing, powerful God that you and I know about that much of. Right? Let me give you another one that's even more important, biblical example. Jesus' executioners. Peter stands up on the day of Pentecost and he gives this great sermon about how Jesus is the Messiah, right? And he's standing in front of thousands of Jews. Among them are people that were involved in the execution of Jesus. Listen to what he says in Acts chapter 2. He says, God knew, here's his omniscience, God knew what would happen. Listen to this. And his prearranged plan was carried out when Jesus was betrayed. Who betrayed him? Judas. God didn't go, oh, shucks, Judas. Oh, what are we going to do now? With the help of lawless Gentiles, listen, you nailed him to a cross and killed him. But God released him from the horrors of death, raised him back to life, for death could not keep him in its grips. Do you see what's happening in just those two verses? This is a beautiful picture of God's providence and man's poor choices. He says, look, Jesus was betrayed, but it's part of God's prearranged plan. You crucified him, but that ain't going to stop God's plan. He raised him back from the dead. Your bad choices, my bad choices, never frustrate the hand of providence. Amen? You need to be happy about that, because I don't know about you, but I make a bunch of bad choices all the time. And God's not up there going, dang, what are we going to do now? Here's number 4. The hand of God is another provision of his grace. Listen, God doesn't have to put his hand into history. Somebody described providence like this. It's the hand of God in the glove of history. I kind of like that. But here's the deal. God doesn't have to. There's something called deism. A deist believes that God created the world and everything in it and just kind of walked away. Picture an old-time watch. We don't use watches like this anymore. But picture the old-time watch. Some of you can remember you had to wind them, right, to get them to work. And they would eventually run down and you'd have to rewind them. The deist kind of pictures God like the great clockmaker. He takes the clock, he winds it, he sets it down, and he walks away. He doesn't ever step in miraculously. He doesn't step in to tinker with anything. He just gets it all started and he leaves it to itself. We don't pray for intervention because God's not going to intervene. There is a God and he's there, but he doesn't intervene into any of the affairs of men. He just kind of winds up the watch, leaves it sitting there, and lets it go. That's what a deist believes. And you know what? He could have done it that way. If he chose to, he could have done it that way. He's God. He could have done it that way. But praise God, he didn't do it that way. You say, Randy, how do you know the deist isn't true? Because he's left us his word, and he's told us all through his word stories like Ruth, where he is intimately and intricately involved by the hand of providence in the affairs of people. And why? Why is he involved? Because of grace? Because he says, you guys are a bunch of screw-ups, and if I just left you to yourself, this would be a big mess. It's going to be a big mess anyway. But you got to know that I have a plan and an end plan, and it will get to where it's going. So, providence? Yeah, guess what? This message comes to us at just the right time. Do you believe that? It's not just a coincidence. What do you mean, Randy? 4 hurricanes, major earthquakes in Mexico, fires all up and down the West Coast, crazy international stuff going on. Are we going to war with North Korea? Is Russia really involved in our computer system? Is our government really in chaos right now and we don't know it? All this stuff. And add on top of that, a mass killing by a guy we can't figure out. Why did he do it? My gosh, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. What is happening? Where is it all going? I don't know, but I know this. Providence. Providence. The hand of God is in it all. You say, how does that, I don't have all the ins and outs for you. That's way above my pay grade. I tell you this, there is a God who knows all, who is sovereign over all, who is intimately and intricately involved in every part of history. Not just the big picture, but for the little guy like you and me. Providence. Amen? Would you bow your heads, please, and close?